Antitrust policy asks the question, how big is too big? And in what circumstances should we step in to make sure that our markets are operating fairly and not being dominated by monopolies? Diana Moss is the former president of the American Antitrust Institute. She's an adjunct professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and she's also the new vice president and director of competition policy at PPI. And today she joins the podcast to talk about antitrust and competition in the modern economy. We talk about whether big is always bad, how the consumer welfare standard works, and why regulators seem obsessed with big tech instead of other monopolistic industries. If you enjoy the podcast, please make sure to give us a like, a rating, a subscribe. If you really enjoy the podcast, we would appreciate your support at patreon.com/neoliberalpodcast. You can also support us by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Join your local chapter and make a difference in your community. As always, thank you for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Diana Moss. Diana, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Jeremiah. It's good to be here.
Very glad to have you, and excited to be talking about antitrust and competition policy today. And I think the first thing we should do is to kind of highlight where we are, because there's kind of been this interesting journey, I'll say, that the antitrust field has been on in the last few years. And I wonder if you could kind of summarize for us, like, where are we today with kind of how people are thinking about antitrust? Because it's not necessarily the way that we have been thinking about it in the past. There's now kind of different competing schools of thought that are trying to, vie for attention and implement their theory of antitrust. And I wonder if you could kind of just describe at a baseline, where are we right now?
Sure. It's a good question, and one that I think is getting more and more attention from the mainstream public, whereas in the past, antitrust has been a more esoteric issue, kind of confined to the corridors of Washington, D.C., and we're seeing a big change in that. So I would say that we are at an inflection point in antitrust enforcement and competition policy. Ideally, those two work together hand in hand to promote competition for the benefit of consumers and workers and smaller businesses. I think the genesis of this began about 40 years ago when we entered into a phase of very lax antitrust enforcement in the United States. And we can talk more about why that happened. But the bottom line is we have had about 4 decades of very lax enforcement against harmful mergers, very few monopolization cases, which would police for harmful exclusionary conduct designed to push out smaller rivals. The only area of antitrust law that has been relatively consistent in terms of enforcement vigor has been enforcement of anti-competitive agreements, such as cartels. So lots of lax enforcement, a lot of consolidation as a result, a lot of mergers sailing through, creating over time 2 major problems. One is dominant firms that hold significant market shares, say 60% and up. A second problem is markets that are dominated by just a few firms who have very weak incentives to compete hard. And I would actually throw in a third, Jeremiah, and that is dominant firms that are vacuuming up, scooping up smaller rivals, as we have seen in a lot of sectors. So a lot of consolidation, a lot of rising concentration in key markets that really means something to consumers, energy, food, transportation, healthcare. And about 5, 6, 7 years ago, the movement to increase enforcement, the pro-enforcement movement really started to take hold. And that movement has been around since about the late 1990s. But over time, more voices came into the mix, and we now have a much different looking spectrum of ideologies about antitrust enforcement. But about 5 years ago, this movement really accelerated, and we have a different ideology really prevailing over the over-enforcement and policy in the Biden administration today. So that's how we got from where we were 40 years ago to where we are now, facing a very different set of antitrust enforcers with very different ideas about how to enforce our antitrust laws.
So what's interesting here is that it seems like there's kind of different standards that are being applied. We're moving away from this era of very lax enforcement. And some people would say, well, that just means it's time to enforce the rules that we have, but do so more vigorously. But there's a different group of people who seem to want to change the rules entirely.
That is absolutely correct. And this goes back to the comment I made earlier about a new spectrum of ideologies. The spectrum, up until about 5-6 years ago, really had a right and it had a left. And the right, or the conservative voices in antitrust enforcement, really advocated for a laissez-faire approach, a hands-off approach. In other words, markets regulate themselves. We don't need to worry so much about putting referees on the field to make sure that consolidation doesn't create undue increases in concentration and anti-competitive incentives. So also in that school of thought was the idea that mergers are generally pro-competitive because they can lower costs and introduce consumer benefits. That was the right. And that really is what drove the movement of conservatism in the federal court system, where conservative courts have really held sway over enforcement matters and have contributed to a body of case law that does not support strong enforcement. On the left, beginning in the late 90s, was the progressive movement, advocating for more vigorous enforcement under the current standards, the consumer welfare standard that is currently enforced. As of about 5 years ago, we keep returning to that 5-year mark, a new voice appeared. And that voice sort of staked out on the far left end of the spectrum and have been known by a number of names, but most recently, the neo-Brandeisians, advocating for a return to sort of a bare bones style of antitrust enforcement. In other words, large firms generally do not behave in ways that promote benefits for consumers and workers and smaller businesses. Advocating for a return to more bright line tests for what should be illegal under the antitrust laws.
So my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, is that the consumer welfare standard has a pretty basic test that says, in order for, something to be anti-competitive or for it to really violate antitrust law in the way that we understand it in kind of an American context here, I guess. But the consumer welfare standard says it has to be detrimental to the consumer. You have to demonstrate that the regular consumer of whatever this product is, whether it's energy or hospital services or whatever the case may be, that there's some harm being done, whether that's, they're able to increase prices beyond what they normally would, or the quality of the good has degraded or something. But that's the consumer welfare standard. And the neo-Brandeisians, who are named after, Louis Brandeis he was an antitrust guy from like 100 years ago. So they're the neo version of him. They basically take a more simplistic approach of just, well, big is bad. Big can be bad in this wide variety of ways, and you basically can't trust anything big, and anything that wants to merge and get bigger is always suspicious to a first degree. Is that kind of how the breakdown goes? Or, am I kind of being unfair to the neo-Brandeisians there?
No, I don't think you are. I think there's a couple of nuances that are important to talk about. One is, first of all, the consumer welfare standard is often misunderstood as only applying to consumers, but it really applies to any trading partner in any supply chain, right? Whether you're a worker in a labor market, whether you're a smaller firm operating in the middle part of a supply chain, or whether you're the final consumer that consumes products and services. So it's really about trading partners. And so the consumer welfare standard can be applied flexibly across an entire supply chain if there are harms or potential harms from harmful mergers or anti-competitive conduct in any market. And of course, the goal of the consumer welfare standard is to actually get at, well, what are those harmful effects? So for consumers, it could be higher prices, lower quality, less innovation resulting from consolidation or anti-competitive conduct. For workers, it could be lower wages. It could be weaker benefits. For small businesses located in a market in the middle of a supply chain, it could be paying higher input prices if there's market power above them. So suffice it to say, the competitive harms can occur anywhere in the supply chain, but there have to be ways to show adverse effects through prices, wages, quality, innovation, loss of choice, loss of bargaining power, you name it. The neo-Brandeisians, as you mentioned, Jeremiah, are not fans of the consumer welfare standard. They see it as a much simpler problem, that size, high concentration, dominant firms is really sort of the litmus test for markets that are not competitive and do not function very well, and ultimately benefit consumers and other market participants. So the key to the consumer welfare standard, to really understanding it, is it's quite flexible, but has not been applied that way, which is why we got this 40 years of lax enforcement.
I like to throw out Google sometimes as an example, because I think just the way that people see Google is very different from these two different paradigms. Under a consumer welfare standard, Google initially grew up as this search engine, and now it does a lot of things, but it was a search engine, and it quickly assumed like 90% market share of internet searches. And that's very big. Obviously, that is a dominant market position. But by the consumer welfare standard, you look and you say, well, it's free to use Google, and it's nearly costless to switch if you want to use something else. There's very few barriers to entry. And it sure seems like consumers get a lot of consumer surplus out of it. And they used a lot of their profits to create things like Gmail and Google Maps and Chrome and a lot of these services that are basically free to end consumers. And so from a consumer welfare standard, Google is big, but not necessarily bad. They maybe specific things Google has done we can argue about, but Google's position overall might not necessarily be bad, even though they are dominant. Whereas the neo-Brandeisians would be much more apt to say, well, Google having 90% of the market is bad, just full stop. And we don't need to examine the rest of it. It's just, they have too much power politically that way, or they're going to abuse it eventually. Is that kind of a good example? Because that's the one I've always, gone to when I think about like, what's a company that these two points of view would see very differently.
Yeah, I think you're in the ballpark. Let me just add sort of the middle part of the spectrum. So we go harking back to this discussion of the spectrum. Now, instead of just the right and the left that we had until about 5 years ago, we now have the neo-Brandeisians on the left, the conservative views on the right, advocating for very light-handed enforcement, and we have this middle part of the spectrum, the center left, which is what I call the progressives part of the spectrum. The progressives would view Google as obviously as a large digital platform, a digital ecosystem. And you're absolutely right. Consumers don't pay with dollars when they go into a digital ecosystem. They pay with their attention, with their eyeballs. And it raises concerns around, well, how much data is being collected from consumers? How is that being used and harvested using machine learning and artificial intelligence? And do consumers is their privacy protected in the digital ecosystem environment? So key to the consumer welfare standard is any adverse effects, should they occur, don't necessarily have to result in higher prices. They can result in lower quality, for example, loss of consumer privacy, interacting in digital ecosystems. So that is the kind of the beauty of the consumer welfare standard, is it can assess effects in different ways. And there are, in the digital world, which is increasingly encompassing around our activities and our society, not paying with dollars is more common as opposed to paying for products and services with dollars. But there still could be adverse effects from anti-competitive conduct or mergers. Now, if you're talking about digital platforms where we're dealing with advertising markets, for example, then yeah, those are real dollars changing hands between the platforms and publishers and advertisers.
It's an interesting point about privacy. I tend to be a little bit skeptical of privacy arguments naturally, just because in the abstract, if you ask people in a poll, do you care about your privacy? Do you care about tech companies collecting your data? They will say, yes. Oh, we care very much. But every single time you give them the practical option to trade their privacy for a little bit of convenience online, people are going to click the box. Everyone accepts the cookies, no. So in that sense, I'm always a little skeptical there. And I think it's hard to make an argument that like Google has been bad for the average person, and it would be better if we had broken it up 10 years ago. That's just me being very pro Google. I get no money from Google. I wish I did, but but I do want to ask one thing. You kind of described the politics of this. That used to be pretty simple. Conservatives were more in favor of lax enforcement, and liberals and progressives and Democrats, that camp was usually more in favor of the stricter enforcement. And was a very simplistic kind of left-right spectrum. But these days, it seems like there's a much more complicated spectrum where you still have some kind of classical conservatives who are just, small government, get your hands out of business regulation. But you've also got a lot of conservatives these days who are actually embracing breaking up big companies. And this may be because they think the companies are too woke, or because they're mad at tech platforms because they think that they censor conservatives. It could be for a variety of reasons. It could just be that Donald Trump has kind of broken some of the orthodoxy of like conservative economics. But there's this wing of the conservative movement that is now actually very interested in cracking down on big companies. And there's also kind of a schism on the left, as you said, where the far left has turned into a neo-Brandeisian movement, and the center left is more focused on, well, let's enforce things with a consumer welfare standard. How do you think that, is there kind of a realignment going on in terms of antitrust politics that kind of confounds the typical left-right spectrum?
I think there is, but I think it's important to sort of take the Band-Aid off or rip the Band-Aid off what that looks like, because it really does. It's not a complex story. And I think understanding the schism, as you say, is important for how we look at competition enforcement and policy in this country and also globally. So, the populist movement is really a good way to describe the camps on the far right and the camp on the far left, that big is bad, right? Populism has had a resurgence. It depends how you define populism, obviously, but the whole concept of economic power as translated to corporate power, as translated to a weakening of bargaining power for labor, for example, and consumers and smaller businesses not having the entrepreneurial freedoms to enter markets and innovate and add value is really part of this connection between economic power translates to corporate power, and therefore the antitrust laws should be really trained on containing corporate power. So I think that populism has motivated both the right and both the left. So let's take off the Band-Aid. So first of all, on the right, that was a false message. Donald Trump, made his appeal on the basis of very populist types of concepts. But if you trace the evolution of this argument through debates and hearings in Congress, what you find is that most Republicans object to bigness because of what has emerged from the digital sector, but very narrowly, again, around the free speech issues that arose in the 2020 election. So, for example, if you look at the debate over digital regulation or the need to generate new stronger antitrust laws for the digital sector, most of the support for those bills came only on the GOP side because of concerns over free speech in the 2020 election. That is a very narrowly tailored or cabined concern about bigness, and more specifically, bigness in the tech sector.
You're saying that like conservative commentators and politicians, they don't care about how big the oil companies are or pharmaceutical companies. They only care about how big the tech companies are.
I think that is sort of the gestalt on the right end of the spectrum, that big is bad, but big is bad as limited to the digital tech companies, as limited to concerns over free speech on the platforms. And that will not carry the day in terms of invigorating in antitrust enforcement or creating coherent competition policy. That's not the way the progressive center-left part of the spectrum views that. And if you move off to the left end of the spectrum, the neo-Brandeisians, there is a much the idea that big is bad is much more prevalent and much more of a motivator for arguments that we need bright line tests, presumptions that certain types of market structures, certain types of mergers are going to be illegal.
It's always been extremely frustrating to me for the last few years to see that there's this kind of reinvigorated antitrust movement, which, could be good, could be bad, but that it is almost entirely focused on the technology sector and not on things like, things in the hospital chains that kind of dominate certain markets or other parts of our medical supply chain. It's not focused on telecoms. It's almost exclusively on like these big name, famous big tech companies. And it seems to me like this is very political from both sides, from both the far left and from the GOP. I mean, is this, as an antitrust scholar, do you think that there should be, is it fair that there's so much focus on big tech? Do they deserve that? Or should some of the focus be somewhere else?
Well, first, you're absolutely right that there is an enormous focus on big tech. And in fact, the Biden administration's antitrust enforcers at the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission were actually chosen and installed because of their focus on bigness, but bigness in the tech sector. So there's a whole history there around this focus on big tech.
And can I butt
Sure.
in with because I've had this question for a while that I've heard something, and I wonder if you've heard the same thing. I've heard that basically the reason the Biden administration has kind of taken this approach is that as part of kind of the reconciliation process of after the primary, we're bringing in people from all the different camps and we're making nice with all the other candidates, that they imported a lot of Elizabeth Warren staffers. And that has driven a lot of this approach towards antitrust, is that the Warren staffers helped get people like Lena Khan in place. And that's why the Biden administration is so kind of friendly towards this approach.
Yeah, I think there was. I don't know the exact details. I mean, there are obviously a lot of potential scenarios and explanations, but early on, the neo-Brandeisians, who are really amazing journalists and have that is their major focus, or it was initially was their major focus, was journalism and policy, not antitrust lawyers, not antitrust economists or strategic management, business experts, that kind of thing. So very different set of disciplines. Really made some serious inroads into the left end of the spectrum and the various offices there, and there was a marriage of sorts, a convergence with the Biden administration, which most assumed would be center left. And I think still is very center left, but on the antitrust front has opted to go more to the left end of the spectrum in terms of choosing enforcers and shaping policies.
Yeah, I suppose that makes sense. I've just always wondered about that. But
you raise a really good point, Jeremiah, and that is this outsized focus on the digital tech sector. And one thing that is very important to realize is that the center left, the progressives, this middle part of the spectrum, have always been focused on all sectors of the economy and competitive concerns in all sectors of the economy. And, we always have to remind ourselves that a market-based system is supported through competition and fair competition and democratic principles. So a market-based system is really integral to a democratic political system. So they're knitted together in this really important and vital way. If you don't have competitive markets, then democratic principles start to be etched away at, and then ultimately fail. So progressives really favor strong, vigorous enforcement on using the consumer welfare standard as sort of a touchstone in all sectors of the economy. And this is one thing that I have spent many, many years advocating for, is that we absolutely should enforce the antitrust laws across all sectors. They are generalist laws. They are not designed to be applied differently sector by sector. But given we have limited resources, these are government agencies with appropriations, and they do not have a blank checkbook that they can write checks to cover everything. They have to make decisions carefully. And while we are battling big tech through monopolization cases, obviously, and heightened merger enforcement, we are seeing a lot of competition problems, serious problems, go unpursued or unenforced. Look at healthcare. Right? Hospital mergers. We have 3 PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers. We have 3 drug distributors, large drug distributors. We have only a small collection of commercial health insurers. We have a huge amount of vertical integration in that healthcare supply chain, which in some cases is really not working for the benefit of consumers and for providers. Look at food and ag. We have enormous consolidation in food and agriculture. Within a 3-year period, we went from 6 large agricultural biotech companies down to 3 as a result of these mergers. Look at wireless telecom, right? We had 4 major facilities-based carriers, and just a few years ago, we're down to 3. We know, as economists, that 4 to 3 mergers are almost inevitably harmful in terms of resulting in higher prices. So you get the picture. I could go on.
The other thing I would add there is just that a lot of these are localized too. Like, we have a couple big telecoms, but there's a lot of areas where they have basically agreements with each other. This is your area, and we don't serve that area. And I've never lived in an apartment in my life that had multiple choices for where to get internet. It's always one carrier. And right. You can say the same thing about like hospital chains, and there's a lot of areas in a lot of states where you have just one hospital system and that's it. And, right. There might be 4 hospitals, but they're all owned by the same conglomerate. And, so if you look at it on a regional level, sometimes the problem is even worse.
Absolutely. And this is how consumers are looking at these increasing levels of concentration. They see it mostly through the lens of a loss of choice. If you go out and interview, 10 consumers off the street randomly and say, hey, have you noticed that there just doesn't seem to be as much competition out there in major markets that as there used to be? And the first thing they will tell you, because I ask this question all the time, is, yeah, I've noticed that. And I've noticed that I just don't have the choice that I used to have between companies to get the goods and the services that I need. So a loss of choice is really the very first thing that consumers are going to notice. And that really is driving this mainstream concern over a loss of competition. So back to the concern over, well, what if we're going to invigorate enforcement? We're all for that, doing that under the consumer welfare standard. But let's apply the antitrust laws across all sectors in an equitable way. Let's recognize serious competition problems across all sectors that really hit consumers hard in the pocketbook, right? Or hit workers really hard in their pocketbooks. For example, the merger of Kroger and Albertsons is potentially going to hit workers really, really hard in terms of wages and benefits. So let's look at all competitive problems. Let's not just focus on one sector for whatever reason, whether it's politically motivated or not, because that does a disservice, to consumers, to markets, and to society.
I mean, from your lips to God's ears, hopefully. So I hope some people out there are listening. And I mean, the other point that I'll make, and then I'll move on for a second, is just that it really strikes me as very political, because if you think about like which sectors of the economy are most kind of vulnerable to rent seeking and to anti-competitive behavior that can really hurt people, I really just don't think the tech sector is a good example of that, because it is by far our most innovative sector. It is, growing and providing jobs and providing wild amounts of consumer surplus by any reasonable standard. And often their services are free to use. And just obviously you can still do bad stuff. Tech companies can do bad things, and I don't deny that. But in terms of like what's the most harmful, you've got to look at some of the other industries where rent seeking is just endemic and everybody knows it. And like they're not drivers of economic growth. They're basically just contests to see how much rent we can get. A lot of these are very highly regulated industries, like the healthcare industry, like the communications industry. And it bugs me that like our most innovative sector is the one that's like the biggest flashpoint. But that is where we are right now. And in fact, we actually have some very big cases that are underway right now against some of the tech giants. I wonder if you could tell our listeners what's going on right now, not kind of in the abstract concepts that we've been talking about, but in terms of actual enforcement against these companies.
Yeah, so I'm happy to sort of run the list for you and bring everyone up to speed sort of on where we're at. But I just wanted to make one comment which dovetails with your very astute comment, your last comment, and that is, and it goes back to these what we call zero price markets in the digital sector, which is where consumers, users don't pay with dollars, they pay with their eyeballs and their clicks and their attention. The harms in the digital spaces are often, as I said, not related to price, could be related to quality if you consider privacy a quality metric, which I think we widely do. But also the allegations are that it slows down innovation if you've got a big dominant platform scooping up smaller rivals and controlling commerce or exchange on their platform. So it's a bit of an attenuated effect that enforcers are alleging in these complaints against the digital tech companies. And, innovation is very, very important. It's also harder to measure as opposed to, say, price effects. So back to your question about what's going on. I think we're in an interesting phase here because the Biden enforcers have brought a lot of tech cases. And the states have brought tech cases as well. We have a very important three-legged stool of enforcement in the U.S. We have public enforcement, both at the federal and the state level. And we have private enforcement, private rights of action in the United States. It's a very unusual legal system. But these three forms of enforcement are really designed to work together and to bootstrap each other and provide options and alternatives for enforcement of the antitrust laws. So we have a lot of cases. We have the Google search case in trial right now as we speak. There's the Google Play Store Play case. There is the Meta cases. We just saw several mergers involving Microsoft and Activision, which the FTC lost. We saw the merger case, Meta and Within for VR fitness reality apps. The FTC lost that one. So we don't really know right now what the outcome of all of this invigorated enforcement in tech is going to be. We don't know because these cases take years and years to litigate. Mm-hmm. And a really important point here is that the Biden enforcers may not be around for that much longer, right? There's a year left, basically, until the 2024 election. We don't know what's going to happen, but these cases will all be in litigation or going into litigation if they haven't already been resolved, which many have been. So the question is, are all these moves by the neo-Brandeisian enforcers, are they going to stick? Are they going to implement reforms and make enough headway that it will stick? And I'm using that sort of analogy because it's important. How much case law are we going to get out that supports stronger enforcement in this period of time that they're in?
Well, and there's another question there, which, you mentioned a couple of fairly prominent cases that the FTC has actually lost. And it raises the question, far be it from me to dance on Lena Khan's grave when she loses a case. But is the legacy here going to be that, well, we tried this theory and the courts just reject it over and over and over? Because that kind of seems like a likely outcome at this point. I mean, I don't know a lot about the law. I will defer to my betters in this case, but what I read tells me that, for instance, the Google case does not seem to have strong prospects. And we know that there's already been losses in other areas. So is there a chance that just the entire legacy of the neo-Brandeisian movement is that we got in power and we tried it and it failed?
It's certainly a potential risk, and I think to fully appreciate the risk, we always have to remind ourselves again that antitrust case law is what shapes the law around enforcement. It's the cases that are litigated. Remember, not all cases are litigated. A lot of antitrust cases are settled, right, before ever going to a federal court. But it's the litigated cases that create this body of case law that future judges then look back to and cite to support findings, whether it goes in favor of a defendant or in favor of the government, the plaintiffs. So the case law is absolutely critically important. And so it could go either way. If we get enough of these cases into the pipeline and we get enough good, strong pro-enforcement outcomes, then that will create a good body, positive body of case law to support future pro-enforcement efforts. If, on the other hand, we get a body of case law and a lot of losses, that also will be cited back to in shaping future case law and frankly, case selection. The agencies aren't really fond of bringing cases along the same lines as cases that they've lost in the past, right? That makes total sense. So we're really in this very uncomfortable position right now of the case law. It could go one way or the other. We don't have enough of it. A lot of it's still going to be in the pipeline when the Biden enforcers may be out of their terms, depending on who then replaces them. So we're in a really uncertain zone right now. But for progressives that really favor stronger enforcement without upending the antitrust laws, without throwing out the standard, it's a very uncomfortable place to be for all those really compelling reasons.
All right. So you and I have been doing a lot of complaining here. Probably me more than you. I like to complain. It's my show. I can do what I want. I'm going to complain all the time. Rah, 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 rah. But I will try to be a little more constructive in this segment. And I'm going to ask, if you were magically appointed, head of the FTC or just the god of antitrust in the United States, the czar. Everybody likes to be a czar of everything these days. So if you are the czar of antitrust and you actually got to set priorities for, what the policy should be and what cases you think we should be pursuing, what should we be going after and what should we not be going after? How should we be using our limited resources? What would your kind of game plan be? And feel free to answer this as broadly or as specifically as you want. If you want to talk about industries that you think need more vigorous attention, if you want to talk about specific mergers or companies that should have been challenged, I would love to hear that. But if we're being critical of the current approach and how they might be wasting an opportunity to get better enforcement and better case law, what would be the approach that you would use here?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a tough one to be asked what I would do if I was antitrust czar. But
it's always easier to be a critic, right? This is why I like being the podcast host, because all I have to do is be the critic. It's so much easier than.
Well, let me take a stab at it and see if I can navigate through. I think guiding principles are really important to be an antitrust czar, and that is first and foremost that the antitrust laws are of general applicability across all sectors. So the government shouldn't be picking winners and losers in terms of applications of the antitrust law. It shouldn't have favorites or disfavored candidates for application of the law. They really are generalist laws. So let's do full spectrum coverage. If I were czar, I would find ways to really support the concept of full spectrum coverage. And I really do think we are at a stage where the agencies need to devote resources. They both got huge bump ups in appropriations in this last go around. So they have significantly larger budgets than they've had in the past. It's really time to do a full-scale assessment of where, in what sectors are we seeing significant evidence of competitive harms, higher prices, lower quality, less innovation and productivity, lower wages, for example, lower benefits, it shifts in bargaining power between workers and large companies. So let's do that. And the agencies can do that through what we call retrospective analysis. They can actually go back and unpack what happened after a merger or what happened after a settlement was reached and a company, for example, was enjoined from engaging in certain types of harmful conduct. Because we need that full spectrum coverage. We need some way to direct resources to areas where they are most needed, where enforcement is most needed. And, a case in point, you asked for examples. The FTC's policy on pharmaceutical mergers for the last 25 years has been to approve every single merger that has come through, subject to some sort of very small targeted divestiture. That has been almost an industrial planning policy at the Federal Trade Commission for years. Antitrust should not be industrial planning, right? It's law enforcement and coherent enforcement policy like guidelines and rulemakings that support strong enforcement. But the fact is, this policy for 25 years to approve every single merger, as opposed to going to federal court to block them, has resulted in fewer and fewer and fewer drug companies, both generic and branded, and has been shown empirically to have resulted in higher prices for generic drugs. That's a bad outcome. That is a sector that's crying out in need of reforms and for a really fresh look at how the FTC is going about enforcing mergers there. Same thing in terms of agricultural biotechnology over at the DOJ. As I said earlier, we went from 6 to 3 farms in a very short period of time in the late 2010s. I talk to farmers all the time and ranchers. I talk to them about the high prices they pay for technology fees for Monsanto or other companies. Their input costs are going up for fertilizer, for machinery, for chemicals. And that squeezes them. It squeezes their margins. And we're losing family farms right and left. And then, that all gets filtered down to consumers in the form of higher prices and potentially less quality and less innovation in the food supply chain. So 2 really good examples, Jeremiah, of sectors to refocus on as part of a plan, if I were czar, to align an antitrust enforcement program with the consumer in mind and the worker in mind and the smaller business trying to get into markets, trying to innovate, trying to make it in a market. Those are some really basic guiding principles.
I really love that answer. And, we also talked about telecoms and healthcare industries as other examples, but I have to admit that I, as a very urban New York City dwelling person, do not often think about where my food comes from and the larger food supply chain. And so, thinking about like the big ag companies like Monsanto is not something I do very much. But, I appreciate when somebody reminds me that exists and that we should probably pay more attention to it. So big fan of that answer.
Thank you. And like you say, there are other sectors too. We didn't even get to healthcare. That's probably a whole nother podcast or other or energy or transportation. Look at airlines. Now, I do want to say for the record that the DOJ had an enormous win blocking or unwinding the Northeast Alliance, which was the code share between American Airlines and JetBlue, which was just absolutely anti-competitive. Fares would have gone up, capacity would have gone down. Everyone connecting through some of these Northeast airports that were affected would have been really harmed. That kind of enforcement action. But I also want to say that enforcement in the transportation sector, airlines in particular, this is not a new thing for the neo-Brandeisian enforcers that we have in under the Biden administration. The DOJ has been handling airline mergers for a long, long time and airline antitrust matters for a long time. It's not like the entire docket is digital. In the digital sector, there is a mix of cases, but again, when we're dealing with agencies that have budget constraints through appropriations, it is really, really vital to make sure that the laws are enforced equitably across all sectors.
I always think about some of these things, and I don't know if I'm just using different language than the economists, because I imagine the economists and the lawyers have also considered this. But I always think about it in terms of like, how easy is it to exit? Like when you talk about like the monopoly on internet search, I tend to not take it very seriously because, if you want to use a new search engine, it's a 5-second process. You type in duckduckgo.com or you type in bing.com or some of these alternative ones. ChatGPT is now an alternative to Google in many instances. And it's very, very easy to switch away from Google, even though Google has a dominant position. Whereas, like you said, if there's airlines that are trying to code share or trying to merge, there's a limited number of airline spots available in any airport, and they hoard them so they're not available for anyone else to get. And it's a billions and billions of dollars if you ever want to start your own airline to compete with them. And it's actually very difficult to kind of switch in that instance. And so I always think about which industries is it actually easy for the consumer to switch and like go away from an abusive practice if they're not happy, versus which industries is it actually very difficult or nearly impossible to get out of those dilemmas if you find yourself in them.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a great, the switching question is a direct feed into the choice question, right? If consumers lack choice, then that means there are very few opportunities or alternatives for them to switch to. But, on top of just having those options in theory, the question is, well, how easy is it to switch, right? Have you made an enormous investment in a $1,000 smartphone? Well, gee, that'll really stifle switching because of these upfront costs and high switching costs. But the two go hand in hand, a lack of choice. And then if there is choice, how easy it is to switch away. I would just note, in comparison to your really good example of slot constrained airports and the inability of smaller airlines to access certain airports because they can't get takeoff and landing slots because they're too expensive or they're being hoarded. That is such a different scenario, for example, than say social media, where we actually saw Facebook lose significant market share after the Cambridge Analytica data breach, which really hit consumers hard. It really made an impression on users because of the data breaches. But there was a significant reshuffling of share and the emergence of new players in social media, the emergence of new.
Oh yeah, and I mean this happens all the time. I mean, I cover this a lot on my blog, which is unrelated to politics. I have a blog called Infinite Scroll where we talk about social media phenomenon, and like with everything going on with Twitter right now, you've seen a bunch of Blue Sky is growing very quickly. Threads from Instagram spun up a Twitter clone in just a few months. Mm-hmm. And like, it's a very, very dynamic place where people are not afraid to switch. And, in fact, a lot of people are just quitting Twitter now because they just don't think it's cool. And all the original content is coming from TikTok now. So, I think it's a valid thing to talk about, but we are coming up on time now. So I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast. And that is, what can people do if they want to learn more? If they're fascinated by what we're talking about here if they want to learn more about antitrust or neo-Brandeisian people or just the cases that are ongoing, what would you recommend? And this could be people to follow on Twitter. This could be blogs to read, books. This could be anything that would help them get informed.
Sure. So my recommendation is always, if people want to learn more about the antitrust laws, about antitrust enforcement and competition policy, go to the organizations that are producing really, really high quality, evidence-based content, right? They're not just hand waving and espousing certain theories or ideologies, but they're actually producing research and analysis, which is consumable in any number of formats, all the way from reports down to blogs and to Twitter posts that sort of distill and boil down these basic concepts. But go to organizations like the Progressive Policy Institute, where I am setting up this new Center for Competition Advocacy, to read and to become educated on the issues swirling around competition and how the laws work, for example, and even go so far as to get involved. There are a lot of grassroots-based organizations that do a pretty decent job of educating people about the importance of competition and strong enforcement. But websites like the Progressive Policy Institute, there's Public Knowledge, for example. There are lots of groups producing very incredibly high-quality analysis, but giving users different formats to access it through, from more complicated to very, very, very digestible.
All right. Well, I am very much looking forward to seeing what comes out of PPI's new Antitrust Center and all the work you're going to be doing. I want to say thank you one more time to my guest, Diana Moss. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.